Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fifth stage of a series in which we explore the Reformation in Sweden. For the first four stages of our series, we've looked a little bit at the context in which the Reformation took place and how the Reformation began to to transform some areas of life in Sweden, such as law, such as the political landscape, for example. But we have to remember that the first goal of the reformers was really to reform the church itself. The church at the time was corrupt, holy scriptures were not preached in the churches, and the practices were not really in line with what holy scriptures taught. And so the reformers saw a need for the reformation of the church in the first place. Now, when we talk about the reformation of the church, obviously, we know the sources from Germany with Martin Luther and also in Geneva with John Calvin. These are well-known, documented sources that tell us a lot about the Reformation in those parts of Europe. For Sweden, there are sources as well, but they are a bit less known. And so today we are going to visit a location that will help us understand, that will give us a glimpse of what was going on in the Church of Sweden at the time. So to do so, we are going to visit a province which is named Östergötland. If you look at the map, you see there that it is located on the southeastern part of the country. And as we zoom in, we see that the main city in the area is Linköping, but we are going to go west from Linköping towards the lake. That big lake that you see there is Lake Vättern. And there on the shores of the lake is a small town named Vadstena. Now, Vadstena has about 5,000 inhabitants, so it's not big, and it's an ideal location for tourism by the shores, at the shores of the lake, of course. That's quite ideal. But if you walk through the town, you will quickly realize that this is an ancient town, a medieval town. There are several buildings dating back to the medieval times, such as a castle that was built at the time of Gustav Vasa, and also Vadstena was the location of an important monastery. And to find traces of that monastery, we are going to look at today a place, a church which is named Vadstena Klosterkyrka, that is Vadstena Cloister Church. Now, that was the church that belonged to the monastery, and next to it there is, in fact, today a hotel, which also belonged to the monastery at the time, and a park around. So that's where the monastery was located. It's a monastery that was founded in the 14th century by a famous mystic of the time named Bridget of Sweden. And she was in fact the founder of the order of the Bridgetines, which is quite widespread, in particular in the Nordic nations. And so this became the very first monastery of that order. Now, the monastery itself was dismantled at the end of the 16th century, but it grew in importance very quickly from the time of its foundation. So much so that at the time of the Reformation, the monastery was one of the most important monasteries of Sweden. It reported directly to the Pope. And also it was one of the richest monasteries of Sweden. It possessed a lot of lands, not only in Vadstena, not only in Östergötland, but also across Sweden. So that was the situation at the time of the monastery. The monastery was also a center of learning, like many monasteries. And there was raised one of the future reformers of Sweden, and his name was Laurentius Andreae. We talked about him already in previous stages. But Andreae went there for a few years before going to Rome, where he would study at the university there. Now, the reason we are talking about Laurentius Andreae and the reason why we are visiting Vadstena is because of a letter that Andreae wrote on the 14th of February 1524. 14th of February, that's Valentine's Day, but it had nothing to do really with a romantic love. This was an argument with the church that was going on at the time, which was written in that letter. And we read there, in fact, the defense, the argumentation from Laurentius Andreae. But before we look at that more in details, we need to look a little bit at the context of the time. We've talked about it already in previous stages. We know that Sweden was at war with Denmark since the beginning of the 16th century. But by the beginning of the 1520s, Gustav Vasa was now leading the Swedish army in the Swedish War of Liberation, that is the war that led Gustav Vasa to regain the lands that belonged to Sweden from the hands of the Danes. But by the beginning of 1524, the resources for Gustav Vasa were becoming very low. He needed money. War costs money. And the fact is that at the time, the place where money could be found was in the churches, in the monasteries. And so Gustav Vasa began to ask for loans from the churches, from the monasteries. And so such request was also made there in Vadstena. Now, the Abbey of Vadstena initially provided for a portion of the silver that was bestowed on the shrine of Saint Catherine, which was there. Shrines were all over the places at the time, and they generated a lot of money to the churches. And so the Abbey accepted to give a portion of the silver dedicated to that shrine. But for Gustav Vasa, that was not enough. He needed much more than that. And so he returned again with a request to give for a loan. So it was not a gift that he was asking, but a loan. But this time, the Abbey seemed to refuse, at least that's what the letter reveals. And they were in fact the monks were accusing the king of felony of holy things. That was a serious accusation. Felony is a crime of the highest level against holy things. And the letter is written in that context in order to refute the accusation of felony. So let's look at the letter more in details, because it's a very precious letter, very important letter. We see there how Laurentius Andreae builds his case on Holy Scriptures alone, not on his own reasonings, but on Holy Scriptures. And he deals mainly with 3 points. And the first point that he deals with is the wrong understanding of the monks regarding the church. The definition of the word church had been corrupted over the centuries. For the monks, as it was for the Roman Catholic Church at the time, the word church really meant the clergy, it meant the priests, and it meant the material belongings of the church. Mainly that's what it meant, the word church. But Andreae goes back to scriptures and he says that no, you are wrong. The church is mainly the community of believers. And so that was the first refutation that he brought in order to build his case. The second point he was addressing then was the meaning of the money of the church. Now, once the word church is defined, and if it is badly defined, then obviously the money of the church will also be badly defined. And for the monks, the money of the church meant obviously the money of the bishops, of the priests, of the clergy in general, and of the belongings of the church, the buildings, that is. But Laurentius Andreae, who quoted from the book of Acts and from the epistles of Paul, said that no, this is the church of the believers in the first place. And according to the Bible, we ought to use that money for the good of our neighbors, and in particular for the help of the vulnerable, that is, the poor, the widows. And let me quote a little bit what he said, because this passage in particular is quite direct. You can see the direct tone in which Andreae was writing, and I quote now. We who are successors of the apostles have abandoned God's word and use his churches, that is to say the people's money, as if it were our own. It were well if we so used it as the deacons did, that is the deacons in the church of the book of Acts, in helping the necessities of our poor neighbors. But we keep it to adorn the walls of temples, or to build the shrines of saints, or for the host, or for other purposes which perhaps are forbidden of God, or nowhere commanded in the Holy Scriptures. End of quote. Now, you see the direct tone there. Now that's not all. Andrea deals with a third point, and that is to do with the war efforts of the king, Gustav Vasa. He criticized, in fact, the refusal of the abbey to provide for money to continue the war efforts. And there he goes again to the Bible, to the Old Testament in particular. He goes to the second book of Kings, where we read there that both King Joash or King Hezekiah were in fact in need of using the treasury of the temple in order to calm the attacks of the enemies of Israel, in order to secure the peace of Israel. So obviously that was not the ideal situation, but the kings did that in order to preserve the peace of Israel. And so by drawing a parallel, Laurentius Andreae said that the war efforts of Gustav Vasa ought to be supported because it was for the sake of the peace of Sweden. And therefore it was not only wrong to accuse the king of felony, of high crime against holy things, but it was even a good thing to help the king in his efforts in order to preserve the peace of Sweden. That's for the letter. And as you can see, Laurentius Andreae really builds his case strongly from Holy Scriptures. He uses the whole of the Bible, the entire Bible, Old and New Testaments alike. And that allowed him to deal with a lot of issues, in this letter in particular, the war efforts, and also the need to care, the Christian school to care for the most vulnerable, the poor, the destitute, the widows. And in fact, here he was laying again the foundations of the Christian school to do such things as healthcare and welfare. The monasteries had started doing that several centuries before, but by his time, as we can see through the letter, neglect was prevalent in the church. Well, that leads us to our times. What would Laurentius Andreae say to our church today, not just the Roman Catholic Church, but even the evangelical churches, with regards to healthcare and welfare? What are we doing with healthcare and welfare? Well, usually Christians today in Europe, in Sweden as well, consider that such tasks are the tasks of the state. We pay our taxes to the state, and the state provides for healthcare, for welfare, for education, and all sorts of things. But in fact, that's a recent phenomenon. Using tax money in order to care for the people is a phenomenon that arose in particular in the 20th century. Before that, for all the previous centuries, such things were provided by the church. In fact, one social commentator said very clearly that Christian action has been substituted by statism, that is, state charity, welfarism, now handed over to the state. And Christians were very happy to do so. Towards the end of the 19th century in particular, that's when it began. Well, in fact, the church used to provide for healthcare, for education, welfare, and at the same time took care of its own church buildings, all of that with tithes and also with offerings. This was basically how the church functioned. Today, the state uses income taxes, which are way beyond 30% of the income, usually in Europe, in order to provide the same things. That's because the state is not anointed by God to do so, and so even the provision of welfare and healthcare and so on doesn't function as well as the church could do, because it is not personal. It is, in fact, very bureaucratic. And so really, Andreae would come today and also call the church to get back to its initial call, the call to care for the poor, for the destitute, to do such things that have been now handed over to the state. Yes, the visit here in Vadstena really shows us that the church today is as much in need of a reformation as it was in the 16th century. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next time for another stage of European Journeys.